The cabinet room was silent, but the tension could be felt in every corner. Winston Churchill leaned over a table strewn with maps and reports, surrounded by men who had spent decades building their authority, their reputations, and their judgment. American generals pressed for immediate action, British field commanders insisted on caution, and Stalin's emissaries demanded absolute commitment. Every option was a compromise of principle. Every decision would ripple across continents. Lives, trust, and alliances were at stake, and no one could predict the cost. Churchill understood the weight of the moment. He saw that delay or miscalculation could destroy months of planning, shatter confidence in London and Washington alike, and fracture the fragile unity that held the Allies together. His generals, experienced and resolute, were cornered by their own professionalism, trapped between the necessity of action and the imperatives of politics. Obedience, they knew, might demand sacrifice beyond the battlefield. Disobedience carried consequences equally severe. The pressure was visible, though unspoken. Officers shifted uneasily. Reports marked troop movements that could not wait, and yet every move was questioned. Stalin's representatives expected loyalty, promises, and compliance. Any hesitation signaled weakness. Any misstep risked the very survival of the coalition. Churchill's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of men whose reputations had been forged in fire, whose judgment was respected worldwide, and yet who could not see what he saw, the alliance itself teetering on the edge of fracture. Outside, the war continued with ruthless indifference. Cities burned, armies advanced and retreated. Supply lines faltered and recovered, yet within this room, the war's trajectory was determined not by guns or tanks, but by counsel, ego, and the silent calculus of survival. Churchill knew that the decision before him was not about strategy alone. It was about authority, perception, and the survival of trust across nations. One path promised immediate compliance with his generals, a clear assertion of professional military judgment. The alternative offered alignment with Stalin, the necessary partner for victory on the Eastern Front, yet it risked alienating his own command and sowing doubt about his judgment. Either choice carried irreversible consequences. The room seemed to contract under the weight of anticipation. Every man understood that the alliance could fracture, that reputations could be ruined, and that history would judge every action harshly. Churchill's finger rested on a report detailing the latest intelligence from Moscow. The situation was urgent, yet the formal recommendations from his military advisors suggested caution. Delay, they argued, would preserve forces and minimize loss. But delay also handed initiative to Stalin, whose armies had already borne the brunt of the German onslaught. To support Stalin fully now would reinforce his position, guarantee his influence, and bind Britain to a political choice that might be resisted by generals whose careers were tied to command autonomy. The room held its collective breath. No one spoke, yet every man calculated, weighed, and measured the consequences. Lives hung in the balance, but so did the integrity of command. Missteps here would not be forgiven. Alliances, once broken, heal slowly, if at all. Churchill understood that history often records victories, but neglects the cost of internal cohesion. Decisions taken in the name of unity could destroy that unity if misjudged. And so the question lingered, would Churchill side with his generals, affirming the principles of professional military judgment at the risk of alienating an essential ally? Or would he back Stalin, ensuring commitment on the Eastern Front while undermining his own command structure and straining relationships with men who had long relied on his judgment? There was no neutral ground. Every decision would leave someone exposed and someone in power diminished. The air was heavy with anticipation. Outside the room, dispatches arrived with increasing frequency, marking each hour of inaction as a moment of potential loss. The generals' quiet frustration was palpable. Their expertise weighed against political necessity, each argument sharpened by the subtle pressure of alliance diplomacy. Stalin's representatives watched closely, interpreting hesitation as weakness, measuring Churchill's willingness to act in favor of the Soviet Union. Every second amplified the stakes, every glance exchanged across the table carried meaning. Trust could be shattered with a word, a decision, or the perception of indecision. Churchill recognized the paradox. To delay was to risk the alliance. To act decisively could alienate his closest military advisors. The room, dense with experience and ego, became a crucible. Every man knew the consequences were not hypothetical. Every man knew the cost would be paid in reputations, if not in lives. At the heart of it was the unspoken truth. Churchill could not satisfy all parties. He could not protect every career. He could not ensure that all would agree with the outcome. Someone would lose power. Someone would feel betrayed. The alliance itself was at risk, and yet, in that moment, the decision had to be made. Churchill's hand hovered over the maps, absorbing intelligence, considering supply, evaluating positions, and measuring human cost. The room waited, constrained by protocol, by hierarchy, and by the knowledge that history would not forgive hesitation. Outside, armies pushed forward with relentless momentum, indifferent to political calculus, indifferent to pride or ego. Time pressed against the Allies as surely as it pressed against their enemy. The crisis was raw, immediate, and unavoidable. One choice would secure military cohesion but risk political fallout. The other would solidify the alliance but fracture trust among the generals whose judgment had long guided Britain's campaigns. Every option carried consequences that could not be reversed. Churchill understood that the next action would determine not just the war, but the contours of leadership itself. And so the room held its tension, dense with possibility and danger. The war continued outside, but the battle in this room was no less decisive. Every life, every strategic position, every ounce of trust hung on a decision that had yet to be made. One man, cornered by circumstance, reputation, and alliance, would shape the course of history. The tension that had filled the cabinet room did not dissipate with the first decision. It rippled outward, subtle but unrelenting, into every corner of the Allied command. Military advisors whispered their assessments, each imbued with the authority of experience, yet tinged with frustration. Their calculations weighed casualties against logistics, timing against terrain, and political risk against strategic necessity. Each report underscored a simple truth: the alliance could not afford hesitation, and yet every choice carried peril. Churchill had long understood the precarious balance of coalition warfare. He knew that leaders who subordinated ego to strategy often gained respect, while those who wielded authority as a shield for pride risked isolating themselves. Here, those principles collided. Stalin's demands were unambiguous. Rooted in his own pressure to secure the Eastern Front, he required commitment, not caution. Delay was interpreted as weakness. Agreement was measured not only in words, but in action, and inaction had consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. The generals, too, were acutely aware of the stakes. Years of experience had taught them that premature decisions could ruin campaigns, yet now they faced the paradox of political necessity overriding professional judgment. Their advice was grounded in logic, grounded in precedent, grounded in responsibility for lives they could not control. And yet Churchill, weighing each recommendation, recognized that professional correctness might not satisfy the broader requirement of alliance cohesion. The room, though calm, was dense with pressure. Each observer, each participant, carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. The choices presented were never simple. One path assured the satisfaction of Britain's military hierarchy, but risked eroding Soviet trust. The other aligned Britain fully with Moscow, but strained the relationship with those who had long depended on Churchill's support for strategic autonomy. Every decision required a trade, and no trade was without cost. Historical patterns had brought them to this point. Churchill's career had been shaped by the tension between strategic necessity and political calculation. Earlier in the war, He had tolerated dissent when it served operational advantage. He had balanced personalities, managed disputes, and orchestrated compromise. But in this instance, compromise was insufficient. The stakes extended beyond immediate objectives. The cohesion of a multinational coalition hung by a thread, and each day of delay increased the tension. Backstory mattered. Churchill's relationship with his generals had always been complex. Respect was mutual, but often reluctant. Decisions in North Africa, Greece, and the Middle East had tested these dynamics repeatedly. Generals trusted his vision, yet sometimes doubted his methods. Now, the pressure of an external alliance magnified those internal doubts. What had once been manageable friction became a potential fracture. History did not record small disagreements, but it did remember when they became decisive. The trigger for the crisis was concrete. Intelligence reports highlighted the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front. German advances threatened Soviet positions previously assumed secure. Stalin's communiques, formal and implicit, demanded unequivocal support from Britain. Churchill's generals advised measured response, advocating caution to conserve forces and maintain operational integrity. The tension between urgency and prudence crystallized into a single, unavoidable choice: whom to trust and how to act without alienating essential partners. Immediate reactions were subtle but telling. Advisors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing toward Moscow, others toward the Prime Minister. The political implications were as present as the military ones. No one doubted the necessity of decision, only the consequences it would entail. Alliances are not upheld by clarity alone, but by the perception of reliability, and any perceived misstep risked unraveling months of careful diplomacy. Escalation was inevitable. The pressure from all sides intensified. Political leaders monitored every dispatch, each conveying both information and expectation. American observers, cautious yet impatient, evaluated British compliance. Soviet representatives interpreted each moment of hesitation as leverage. Internal conversations, previously private and measured, became more pointed. Silence itself grew heavy, signaling disagreement that could not be openly expressed without risk. The impossible choice emerged fully. Churchill faced a binary: affirm the authority of his generals, satisfying professional norms while jeopardizing the alliance, or side decisively with Stalin, ensuring cooperation on the Eastern Front, but risking domestic and military credibility. Each option was incomplete, each choice a compromise with latent consequences. He could not satisfy both. One decision would preserve political trust but fracture military confidence. The other would maintain operational unity at the cost of perceived leadership integrity. Compromise, when finally reached, was imperfect. Churchill maneuvered to secure Soviet cooperation while offering assurances to his generals, but the solution was fragile by design. It addressed immediate pressure, yet it did not resolve underlying tension. Authority had been redistributed, trust recalibrated, and expectations reset. The alliance would continue to function, but its cohesion was contingent, delicate, and endlessly negotiable. In the aftermath, practical outcomes were measurable. Operations continued, forces were mobilized. Coordination, though strained, persisted. Yet personal and institutional reputations were altered. Generals who had resisted fully understood the limits of their influence. Political observers recognized Churchill's willingness to prioritize alliance over domestic military preference. Stalin's position was reinforced, not through battlefield conquest alone, but by the demonstration of political leverage. Long-term consequences unfolded subtly but persistently. Eastern Front operations benefited from British support, but delays and recalibrations in Western theaters reflected the lingering effects of internal tension. Command confidence was tempered. Strategic planning incorporated contingencies for alliance friction. Trust, once recalibrated under duress, never fully returned to its prior ease. Operations proceeded, but with a continuous awareness that authority, loyalty, and power could be contested even among allies. The real lesson extended beyond this single crisis. Leadership in coalition warfare is as much about perception, patience, and diplomacy as it is about strategy and command. Ego, carefully masked as professionalism, can govern outcomes as decisively as tactical brilliance. Decisions taken under pressure shape not only campaigns, but relationships, reputation, and the subtle balance of power. The war continued, and ultimately, it was won. But the quiet fractures created in this moment between a prime minister, his generals, and an essential ally left their imprint. The cost was not counted in guns or soldiers alone, but in trust, authority, and the fragile confidence that sustains alliances. One choice, quietly made, carried consequences that would echo through the remainder of the conflict. The decision was made. Churchill had aligned with Stalin, committing Britain to support the Eastern Front fully, even as some of his own generals bristled at the perceived compromise. The alliance held, but the balance had shifted. Operationally, the Soviets now advanced with renewed confidence, relying on British support that had been promised, measured, and calculated. Politically, however, the choice left subtle fissures. Authority had been exercised, but at a cost that could not be ignored. Generals adjusted to the new reality. Their recommendations were respected, but their influence had been redefined. They understood that obedience, even when guided by reason, was sometimes secondary to larger strategic imperatives. Decisions in coalition warfare, they realized, were rarely about who was right, but about who could bear the consequences without fracturing the alliance. Trust was not destroyed, but it became conditional, measured in actions rather than words. Churchill, meanwhile, bore the weight of both choice and precedent. His authority had been reinforced internationally, yet internally it was tempered. His willingness to subordinate his generals to broader necessity preserved cohesion at the highest levels, but reminded all that political survival sometimes outweighs professional judgment. He had secured the alliance at a moment when delay could have invited disaster. He had managed ego, ambition, and expectation, navigating the intricate pressures of global coalition leadership. The aftermath extended beyond the immediate military campaigns. Eastern Front victories were achieved with British support, but Western operations moved more cautiously. The psychological effect of the decision lingered. Commanders, aware of limits imposed by political necessity, weighed every action not just for tactical outcome, but for its impact on coalition cohesion. Timing, once a purely operational concern, became entwined with diplomacy and perception. Each choice carried double meaning, each order evaluated for its political as well as military significance. Long-term consequences were subtle yet pervasive. The Soviet Union emerged as a dominant military power on the Eastern Front, its position reinforced by Britain's decision to back Stalin decisively. British generals retained their careers, but the memory of compromise remained. Future operations were planned with awareness that authority, even under a unified command, could be contested. The lessons of this crisis influenced coordination, negotiation, and execution throughout the remainder of the war. The cost of alliance management became as critical a factor as any battlefield strategy. History remembers the war as a series of victories and losses, of battles won and cities liberated. Yet the quiet, behind-the-scenes decisions often shaped outcomes more profoundly than guns or tanks ever could. Churchill's choice to back Stalin over his own generals did not produce immediate headlines, but it determined the pace, cohesion, and alignment of Allied forces at a decisive moment. What appears in retrospect as inevitability was, at the time, a perilous exercise in judgment under pressure. The lessons of leadership emerge not from unbroken success, but from the navigation of impossible choices. Ego, disguised as professionalism, can dictate outcomes as effectively as strategy. Trust, once strained, never fully returns to its original simplicity. Alliances fail quietly, not with a single thunderous collapse, but through hesitation, compromise, and the careful balancing of ambition against necessity. Decisions taken in these corridors of power ripple outward, shaping campaigns, reputations, and history itself. In reflection, the story is not about triumph alone. It is about the price of cohesion, the subtle negotiation between personal pride and strategic necessity, and the cost of survival in an alliance bound by differing national priorities. Churchill's choice saved the alliance and strengthened the Eastern Front, yet it carried an enduring burden for his generals and for his command structure. The war was advanced by this decision, but the human and political cost lingered, shaping interactions, expectations, and judgment long after the battlefields fell silent. Victory arrived, but with it came the quiet recognition that some losses are invisible. Trust, authority, and confidence once subtly fractured demanded careful management. Commanders adapted, plans shifted, and history proceeded, guided by decisions made in the pressure of crisis rather than the clarity of hindsight. The war was won, but the psychological imprint of these choices endured. And so the final insight remains: leadership in coalition warfare is never absolute. It is a careful balance between ego and obligation, between immediate risk and long-term strategy, between loyalty to allies and responsibility to one's own command. Decisions that appear minor in reports or dispatches may carry consequences that shape the war for months, even years. One man's choice, quiet yet decisive, altered the course of history in ways that were only fully understood long afterward. The story of Churchill backing Stalin is a reminder that authority is exercised not in isolation, but within the interplay of trust, expectation, and necessity. The war was won, but something else: the simplicity of command, the unquestioned faith between generals, the certainty of personal judgment was lost forever. For those following history closely, the lesson is clear: moments of crisis are never simple. Every decision carries unseen weight, every compromise a hidden cost. And as these stories unfold, we are reminded that understanding the past is more than memorizing events, is seeing the pressure, the ego, and the choices that quietly shape the world. If you found this story revealing and want to explore more decisions that shaped World War II, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. There are countless moments where leadership, loyalty, and strategy collided, and each reveals something about the cost of command in wartime.